Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Natural Aquarium with Ryan right here on Father Fish. Today we're talking about my hard water. And why the heck is it so hard? Well, TDS is one of the reasons, but TDS is not everything, but it is also everything. And that's part of the problem, is the fact that it just is a measure of a whole bunch of different things dissolved in your water. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So I've got some lists for you here. What is TDS? Well, if you take a look at the list here, it's mostly a bunch of things that are dissolved in your water, and it's all the way from things that you put there purposely to things that just accumulate over time. You name it, if it's dissolved in your water column, boom, it's probably going to affect your TDS. So, natural aquariums are a little bit different than some of these other types of aquariums, simply because you can accumulate things that wouldn't naturally occur in, let's say, a bare bottom tank, like for instance leaf decay as you're seeing here. And so we need to monitor different things. We're not going to just like use TDS as this wide bat to kind of like combat our water quality. And it's also not the end all for whether or not your water quality is actually good or bad. Instead, you'd probably need to go and test for some very specific things. So in my case, I typically will just look at it as a very brief glimpse into like, hey, do I need to do something with my water? Yes or no? Warning, educational content time again, folks. Let's talk about osmosis. Let's say that we have a cell on the left, and outside the cell is just water or something like that. And of course here's a water molecule, and this is just some random other molecule that is dissolved inside the cell right now. And let's go ahead and we'll balance out our waters, because that's typically what tends to happen, is that the waters will try and balance themselves out. They want to go from high concentrations to low concentrations. So what happens if we have too many things dissolved inside of our water column? Oops, look at that. There's more of those molecules. What happens is that there ends up being a lower concentration of water molecules, where you could just say, hey, the water wants to go towards this thing that's dissolved in, otherwise known as a solute. And so the water is then going to leave the cell. And this is the same kind of thing that's going to happen if you are trying to take a freshwater fish and put it into a saltwater environment. Whoops, all the water left the fish's cells, and now that fish is quite dead. Hey everyone, demonstration time for those of you that need a visual. So let's pretend that this right here is our aquarium. We've got a certain amount of dissolved solids right here inside of our water column, and here's the problem with topping off with more hard water on top of your already hard water. I'm just going to be adding more of these dissolved solids right on top of what's already there, and every time the water evaporates out and I just add more, well, we're getting more and more and more every time we top off with more hard water. And there's no way that your plants are going to be able to take all of that out there if your water is especially hard, especially in the time span that it would take for it to evaporate. If you're in a very arid area like mine, humidity levels are really low all the time. And so I've got to come up with better solutions. My better solution is, number one, stop the evaporation. So I've got tanks that have lids on the top of them, so that way we can stop as much of that water getting off as possible, and that way we don't have to add any more of that water source that has the hard water on it. Now, if you can't stop the evaporation, you might want to consider using some different water sources other than your municipal, or if you're like pulling it from a well or something that's especially hard. And you can invest in something such as a reverse osmosis or distilled water source, and then that way you can add in water that doesn't have all of the dissolved solids, and oh look, we're not contributing to the problem that we already have. So I'm going to talk about water changes. And don't worry, I talked with good old Father Fish there before I wanted to mention this one. And so there is one last solution. Like, if you can't invest in one of those reverse osmosis or distilled water sources, what you can do is you can do water changes. And we're not talking about massive ones. We're not talking about ones that need to occur all the time. I've monitored these tanks for quite some time, and basically I only need to do one every 3 months or something if I have some evaporation happening. And so what are you doing when you're doing a water change? You're taking some of that concentration out, and then when you're adding some back in, it's kind of balancing a little bit, especially if you've got lots of plants, especially floaters. Floaters are really good at taking some of these out, but they're still kind of poor at doing the job entirely. So if you absolutely need to, because you have a hard water source and you don't have access to water that doesn't have as much dissolved stuff in it, you can do some water changes to save your fish. As we're seeing on the footage here, I've taken some water, I distilled it down, and wow, there is a lot of mineral buildup. And this is my big problem in my aquariums, is that sometimes if I have too much evaporation and I keep adding water, oops, the mineral content just keeps climbing, because there's no way that the plants are going to put up with something that's coming out of the tap at about 300-400 parts per million. I decided to track the TDS of several aquariums that I had going over time. The first thing that I did was I tracked them from 1 week, and then after that I decided to track them day by day for an additional 5 days. I would have liked to go another week in total, but unfortunately, hey, winter break happens. So you get 5 days, but you can still see the trend and about where things would have ended up in the data set that I'm about to show you. So the 5 aquariums that we tracked were a 10-gallon standard, and this one has about a 25% opening in the top. And then there is my 20 long. The 20 long has a small, perhaps 10% opening in the top that's not covered by some plexiglass. And then we have a 20-gallon tall. The 20-gallon tall is about 50% covered on the top by glass. And I have a bowl. It's about 2 gallons. It just sits on the countertop. There's no covering whatsoever. And then we have my 40-gallon breeder, and that one is completely covered on the top, and I only open it up once per day to put a pinch of food in there. And then also at one point when we switched over to the second 5 days that happened after a water change, I had just a simple water cup sitting out just to see what happens over time. So data time, what did we see? The bowl has the highest TDS. The reason why it has the highest TDS is because I never do water changes on that bowl. That bowl has been around for many months. I could probably go back and find the footage, but I believe it's somewhere around a year at this point. No water changes, only top-offs with my very hard water. So it's crept up from a starting point of about 300 something out of the tap all the way up to 900 something now. And that is one of the things that of course gives me pause, is that, hey, I have way too much TDS on these things. There's too much buildup, and this is something that ultimately killed some guppies of mine that I had before I knew about this. And that was because it was so high in their tank that the TDS wasn't even able to be registered on this particular probe that I have, because it tops out at 999. And all the rest of them are about the same, because I tend to do small water changes in them of about 20% from time to time, mostly just whenever I feel like it. The fish that are in them, I've got all mostly hard water fish, fish that are used to this kind of hard water, because I really don't like doing water changes. I don't like testing my water or anything like that. No, I'd rather just, have fish that are happy with the water that I've got. Works out for me. So what you'll see, of course, is that again we have the initial first week there, and then I did a refill. I did not do any water change there. So at day 7, we've got a day 7 number, and then we've got a refill, so you'll notice the level will decrease on the TDS here. And then it goes right back up over time, and eventually you'll see at the very end, I did about 20% water change on everything except for the bowl. The bowl got a nearly 80% water change on that one because, of course, the TDS was insane on it. And so you'll see that all the numbers will go down at the very end because of that water change. So the complete outlier other than that bowl will be the 40 breeder. If you check it out, hey, the TDS remains low. In fact, it actually starts getting a little bit lower with the water change. Crazy, right? All you have to do is have a lid on your tank, and congratulations, the evaporation isn't happening, and so therefore your TDS is not going to creep up to some insane amount. Experiment time once again, because we all love leaves, don't we? And we've got to be putting those in our natural aquariums. They're a natural food source. And yes, like everything else that we've listed so far, it will affect your TDS. But I assure you, it's nothing that's going to be too crazy. So let's take a look at putting them in some containers here. This is the same experiment that I ran from the previous video on dissolved oxygen, and you will also see them again when we were considering pH. It was easy enough for me to get all of my probes all in one place and get them all at the same time over 2 weeks worth of data here, so yeah, we went ahead and we did the TDS meter along with the other ones. And so we started off, we ended up making some slightly remineralized distilled water. I took some Epsom salts, measured them out, and then pinched them right into the containers with the distilled water. We also ended up using the aquarium water out of my 20-gallon Endler tank, and that of course already has all the preloaded microbiota that you could imagine in it. Provide a good contrast. So as we'll notice by the data here, there is an initial jump in TDS, and then after a little bit of time we start to level off and we don't see all that much. And you also note that between the distilled and the aquarium water has a more steady increase with time, which makes more sense because we've got more organisms that will be breaking down the tougher components of the leaves, the ones that are more resistant to just dissolving in the water on their own. So of course it would be reasonable that you would continue to see a TDS increase over time as long as you have a bioactive aquarium. So what's our takeaways about TDS today? Number one, TDS is a general measure of a lot of things, so it won't tell you anything incredibly specific, but it can give you an overall idea of what might be going on. Our second thing is to know your water. If your water is hard or soft, you may have to do things about that. And as far as the best thing that you can do about trying to make sure that your TDS doesn't increase is to have a lid. A nice tight-fitting lid that stops most of the evaporation. It'll also help keep your electricity bill a little better too, because it's going to trap some heat that way as well. So there we go. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please consider giving a good old thumbs up down there. Maybe consider subscribing. And most of all, I want to hear your stories about TDS down in the comments. Thanks for joining us here on the Natural Aquarium on Father Fish. We'll see you next time.